As an experienced stress baker, I have never felt less like making bread. If you're a millennial living through the coronavirus outbreak, chances are you've thought about making bread at some point in the past few weeks. And, as someone who loves to bake and got into sourdough just a few months before it became the pandemic carb of choice, you'd think I'd be overjoyed that my newfound hobby is now cool. But no, I'm sorry to say I am just in no mood for this doughy bullshit right now. I've been a stress baker since college, when I was first introduced to the term by a roommate who baked the ugliest and most delicious chocolate chip cookies I've ever had. She plated them too early so they all cooled into one gooey, chocolatey mountain. It was great. Starting with cupcakes, remember when cupcakes were in? I quickly learned that baking was an efficient way to distract myself from the anxieties of the day, earn a sense of accomplishment, and end up with a delicious treat all in one activity. Not only was baking a way for me to distress, it also became a larger part of my identity and a new way for me to connect with my friends. I was someone who knew all of their favorite flavor combinations and brought them cupcakes on their birthdays. I played around with melting and, yes, tempering chocolate to make cookie decorations. I found that homemade pie crust, surprisingly, came pretty easily to me. On a college budget and without an electric mixer, I whipped cream by hand more than once. After sampling some friends' homemade bread a year or so ago, I realized that I was ready to venture out of the world of sweets. But sourdough, as many people are now finding, is challenging and rewarding in an entirely different way. First off, it requires the use of starter, which is a little microenvironment made from flour and water that allows yeast and bacteria to flourish. The combination of organisms is what helps the bread rise and gives it that classic tangy flavor. There is absolutely no shame in using some of a friend's starter or asking a bakery for a bit of theirs to get yours going, but I decided to make my own. I guess I wanted a little more ownership of it? Really, I think I wanted to be able to say I did it all myself. Getting the starter going in the chill of a NYC October took a full month of my life, but now my starter is a hearty little gal I've named Abigail. I've already given bits of Abigail out to a few other people who are now baking delicious loaves. I assume I can only experience them via Instagram now. My first loaves were not pretty, but they rose and that was exciting enough. My subsequent ones have been consistently fine and seem to get a little tangier with every try. Did you know that freshly baked bread crackles when you take it out of the oven? I'm not totally sure why. I think it has to do with the crust and things expanding within it. But whatever the reason, it's the most satisfying sound in the world after what is usually at least a 24-hour sourdough creation process. I would make myself wait just long enough for the loaf to cool so that I could cut into the middle of it, eager to get a look at the pattern of bubbles inside, and then show it off to my now effectively long-distance boyfriend in the other room before we ate dinner together. I even talked to my therapist regularly about my sourdough adventures and once showed him a picture of a loaf I was particularly proud of. All of this is to say that pre-pandemic Sarah was absolutely living for sourdough and the long, slow challenges it brought. The mixing, resting, proofing, and baking processes are a little different for every loaf, and I thrived on the patient experimentation, problem-solving, and tinkering that sourdough requires. My loaves were never perfect and likely never will be, but they were always delicious and worth the effort. It was a reliable, meditative weekend project that took my mind off my Sunday and, let's be honest, Saturday scaries. Plus, baking bread introduced me to a lovely, unique community on Instagram, including a new concert buddy. Considering all this, you'd think the #pandemic bread movement would have spoken directly, specifically, loudly to me of all people. But the truth is that I haven't baked bread of any kind in weeks, and Abigail is sitting idly in my fridge. I want to bake, of course I want to bake, but it just isn't happening. The stress I'm dealing with now is different, obviously, and it's all-consuming. This is not me being nervous about a final exam or a project at work, this is me looking for a way to cope, somehow, with the foundations of our lives suddenly changing and the fear of people I know being hospitalized or dying. Sourdough just can't compete with the existential dread of living through an actual, for-real pandemic. But there are also the superficial blocks. When all I have is time, I can't stand the thought of spending a full day making bread only for it to be not as good as I want it to be. And the Instagrams, dear God, the Instagrams. I can't help but compare my loaves to other people's, some who literally just started baking. The competition, entirely fueled by me and my own lame insecurities, is just inescapable. What have I baked? I made some half-hearted biscuits, sure. I made some matzah for Passover, which was, well, matzah. But I finally had to admit to myself that what I was really craving wasn't a homemade artisan sourdough boule but rather brownies. Extra fudge why? From a box. Specifically, the ones my mom used to make. I've made and devoured 2 full boxes so far. Sourdough and stress baking may have started as an independent, self-directed activity, but I realize now how much I've come to rely on it as a way to positively and authentically connect with other people. It's so cheesy I can barely bring myself to type it, but it's true, baking for yourself is not half as fun or fulfilling as baking with and for other people. I love that stress baking gives me time to focus some creative energy at something other than work, but I also love seeing the way my bakes fit into other people's lives, because they create space for me there too. As nice as it was to spend all day baking bread, it was even nicer to see the joy on my friends' faces when I brought over a freshly baked loaf to go with the nice cheeses and wines they'd picked out for a night of gossip, or to get a text from my boyfriend to say that he was enjoying a slice of my bread with his soup for lunch at work. Without the possibility for those interactions, making bread doesn't give me that sense of accomplishment I crave. It just reminds me of how lonely and hopeless this moment truly feels. If learning to make bread is a quarantine activity that brings you joy, that is wonderful. Embrace it. Lean into it. Maybe try making a starter of your own. But for now, I'm leaning in the other direction, toward nostalgia, simplicity, and comfort, and sticking with brownies. The fudgier, the better.